Some of the most fascinating claims, myths, and misunderstandings in Final Fantasy XIV come about as a result of something that does actually reasonably make sense, but falls flat due to a simple oversight. Other times, it was an observation that used to be true, and the game has since moved on from it, making it false now. I want to go over a handful of these kinds of claims and misunderstandings, and explain how or why they are false, if they are false. And if you know of some strange myths or claims that came about, perhaps through the effort of optimization, that seem a bit dubious, do be sure to share them in the comments. Now, let's get myth busting. Number 1. Holy Spirit has more potency than the average potency of the Paladin filler combo, so using it repeatedly is a gain. This one is slightly more complicated than it might seem, and furthermore is an example of something that some players may have filed as true back when it looked more true, even if it wasn't, and then simply not checked back since. Now, because of the various potency gains Paladin gets as they level up, there are 4 different level ranges where we would need to check this for completeness sake. Level 94 to 100, level 84 to 93, level 76 to 83, and below level 76. So let's get to it. At max level, essentially, the filler combo consisting of Fast Blade, Riot Blade, Royal Authority, Atonement, Supplication, Sepulture, and a Divine Might boosted Holy Spirit, typically not in that particular order, adds up to an average of 430 potency per GZD. Also at max level, Holy Spirit, as is a straight 400 potency. Pretty simple open and shut case. Filler combo is superior. A particular case where Holy Spirit would be worth using is if the boss is going down or leaving for a while in a few GZDs, and your next GZDs otherwise would be Fast Blade, Riot Blade, Royal Authority. In that case, Holy Spirit 3 times would actually be better as a sort of finisher. But that's the specific exception. The reason why the exception is so specific is because your auto attack swing timer pauses while casting, and resumes once the slide casting window begins. This means that casting Holy Spirit costs you 1 second of auto attacks. For all jobs which emphasize the same stat for their actions as their auto attack, meaning strength and dexterity jobs, their auto attacks are always worth 30 potency per second. This means if your swing timer is 3.0, then your auto attacks are 90 potency every 3 seconds. This means that while Holy Spirit is 400 potency, it costs 30 potency and a bit of oath gauge to actually cast it, making Holy Spirit 370 potency. Holy Spirit is of course still good for cases where you have to be out of range, and it is still a solid pulling option, as always. Let's continue. At level 90, the average potency of the previously mentioned filler combo goes from 430 down to only 373. However, Holy Spirit drops to 350 potency as well, 320 when the auto attack loss is counted. Again, same conclusion. Again, 3 Holy Spirits will beat the basic 1-2-3 for finishing a fight. At level 80, the average potency of the filler combo goes down to only 330, but simultaneously, Holy Spirit goes down to a clean, flat 300, or 270 with auto attack loss counted. Again, 3 Holy Spirits beat a basic 1-2-3 to finish a fight. And finally, at level 70, or without the Atonement combo, the filler combo, which is now just Fast Blade, Riot Blade, Royal Authority, Divine Might, Holy Spirit, is now only 292.5 potency per GZD. Meanwhile, Holy Spirit on its own is still 300, 270 with auto attack loss counted. At this point, the specific reason that Holy Spirit isn't worth spamming is precisely because of the auto attack loss, which is often why this misunderstanding comes about. Before Dawntrail, the average potency of Holy Spirit was actually equal to the average filler combo potency, which almost certainly was what gave birth to it in the first place. However, again, in this level range, 3 Holy Spirits beat a basic 1-2-3, but falls short if you also get to use Divine Might. But due to the power of the filler combo, there is an argument to be made that if during fight or flight your last GZD would be Fast Blade, casting Holy Spirit instead might actually be worth it. But in conclusion, spamming Holy Spirit is not a damage gain at any level. However, situationally, it can be useful for finishing a fight. Number 2. Melee Limit Break 1 is actually a damage loss. Depending on who you ask, this claim can range from straight up melee LB1 is not worth using ever to a big fat it depends, which often doesn't lead to a clear enough answer to know what to do with it. So, the limit break itself is a very strange action with a cast time and typically a hilariously long animation lock. The cast itself can be slide casted, but you can no longer move or act once the animation lock begins. A healer can use rescue on you to drag you somewhere else, but that doesn't change the fact that you cannot move. The damage of a limit break is decided entirely by the average item level of your party's weapons. We can demonstrate this in Explorer mode. A lone player with an item level 735 weapon will do around 310,000 damage with a melee LB1. If there's 2 players with I-735 weapons, it still does 310,000 damage. If one of the players is using only an I-710 weapon, the damage drops to only 285,000. And if both are wearing 710 weapons, it drops further to around 266,000. It doesn't matter who is using the limit break, as long as it is a melee LB1, it will do that same damage. An additional notable detail is that, aside from extremely specific exceptions that are typically boss-specific, limit break damage is unaffected by all damage boosting and reducing effects that would otherwise affect a player. This means that a limit break will do the same damage regardless of whether the player is benefiting from raid buffs, a damage down, or a weakness from being raised. Finally, limit breaks cannot crit or direct hit, and are unaffected by all stats on the user, aside from the previously mentioned interaction with weapon item levels. Now, back to the original question at hand. Is it worth it to use melee LB1? Melee LB1 takes 2 seconds to cast, and just shy of 4 seconds of animation lock, meaning that it is essentially a 6-second attack. For example, if your entire team all had item level 735 weapons, the LB would deal about 310,000 damage with a cast time of 6 seconds. This is about 52,000 damage per second. So the simple question is ultimately down to whether you can deal 310,000 damage in 6 seconds on your own without limit break. If yes, then indeed melee LB1 is a damage loss. There's slightly more to it than that, as sure, maybe you cannot do 310k damage at that very moment, but if you continue your rotation, that might generate resources or place you at a point in your rotation where you can do 310k damage during a burst later. It kind of depends on the job. Roughly speaking, Monk, Ninja, and Dragoon don't really generate a burst significant resource, or at least not nearly to the extent that Viper, Reaper, or Samurai does. This means these jobs with less crucial filler rotations can more easily determine whether LB is worth using, as it is unlikely to come back and cost you later. In a similar fashion, if you're actively affected by weakness or damage down, massively reducing your damage output, the fact the limit break is unaffected pretty much always makes it worth using. Obviously, take note that LB1 in these cases are pretty much implied to be used as a fight nears its end almost all the time, so it is also worth noting that there won't be very much time for a job to generate something that leads to something more. After all, if the fight was continuing for a while longer, then you could wait for LB2, right? So, if you want to have a little lab test of your own to see how much damage you are competing against, because ultimately this is probably the best you can do on your own, is to use the Explorer mode option to enter a duty, put down a striking dummy, and use LB1 on it. Take note of how much damage it does, approximately, and then use the number you get to determine how much you would need to surpass the damage that limit break did. In actual combat, the LB will almost certainly swing up or down from that depending on your party, but it is a solid starting point. Knowing whether you need raid buffs, an odd minute burst or whatever to beat LB1 is valuable information, although Most of the time, you can simply postpone Limit Break to after the particular burst that beats it. Indeed, I do believe I concluded this question with something that sums up to "It still depends, Lamau," but that's the best I can offer you. Number 3. Ninja's single target Doton. This is a classic misunderstanding and can stem from a myriad of reasons. In RPGs, if you have a damage over time effect that you can maintain, it is usually optimal to maintain it. Doton is technically a dot. Hence, some ninjas will attempt to maintain it. Another explanation as to why single target Doton comes about is because of monkey see, monkey do reasons. A shocking amount of ninjas may be seen doing this in things like Crystal Tower Alliance raids, often enough that less experienced ninjas trying to improve might assume there's something they're missing and that it is in fact right to use it, even against their better judgment. Yet another explanation is that Doton's tooltip is not very effective at explaining what it actually does. Creates a patch of corrupted earth, dealing damage with a potency of 80 to any enemies who enter. Duration 18 seconds. Based on this explanation, you'd think Doton does damage each time a mob goes into the circle and never at any other time. But even if you know it is damage over time described weirdly, the game doesn't explain that dots tick every 3 seconds, and the game does not explain that placed circles like Doton hits 1 extra time when placed, so exactly how many times Doton hits looks a bit confusing. In reality, it hits 7 times in total, adding up to 560 potency, with the first tick happening at a slightly weird timing instead of every 3 seconds because it happens when it is placed. At the level where it is learned, Raiton already does 650 potency, so simply understanding this difference makes it simple to find the right answer. One more reason some ninjas will choose to use Doton anyway is due to the observation that Doton is a 3 Mutra Jutsu, so it must be superior to Raiton, the 2 Mutra Jutsu. Which I guess is a somewhat understandable assumption, considering Raiton is objectively superior to Huma Shuriken as long as you don't need the damage to be physical. One more detail about Doton versus Raiton is that Doton, being a 3 Mutra Jutsu, takes 3 seconds to perform at its fastest, while Raiton takes 2.5. This is mildly relevant for historical reasons, as back in Shadowbringers, when mudras were changed from OGZD to GZD, yes really, Raiton was placed at 800 potency, while Doton did 100 potency, but hit a total of 9 times, making it 900 potency. But turns out that 800 potency over 2.5 seconds beats 900 over 3 seconds. But because the tooltips didn't accurately explain that it took this long, this time spent angle was often overlooked. Speaking of historical reasons, one final detail about single target Doton is that before patch 6.1 of Endwalker, not only did Doton last 24 seconds instead of the current 18, but Hide did not remove Doton, meaning that an actual optimization strategy in boss fights was to place down Doton and have the tank pull the boss into the Doton for some free extra damage, as the ninja would be able to hide to recover their charges while keeping Doton. Now, long story short, single target Doton is one of those classic mistakes some players make that is insanely obvious for everyone around them, which tends to attract a lot more attention than other, more egregious mistakes one might make, as it stands out so clearly in a crowd. A bit like how Black Mage mistakes are easily pointed out due to the cast timer being right there for everyone to see. Optimally, never use Doton on single target. By the time you learn Fleeting and Forked Raichu at level 90, don't use Doton on 2 targets either. That's it really. Number 4. Does Lilybell still pulse healing if you take 0 damage? No, actually. White Mage's Liturgy of the Bell, very often shortened to simply Lilybell, places down a healing blossom, the Lilybell, that on its own does nothing for 20 seconds. As described in the tooltip, taking damage causes the Lilybell to pulse healing for the party, up to 5 times. If its timer runs out with any stacks remaining, it will pop for half as much healing times the number of remaining stacks. Now, tooltips can't always be trusted, so quote-unquote taking damage could mean being hit, and might not rely on actually losing HP. This is easily tested. Find a mob that can hit you, enter combat with it, use Divine Benison on yourself, and put down Lilybell. Note that when you take 0 damage, it does not pulse healing. When you take damage, it does pulse. Simple, quick, and easy test. And finally, number 5. Standard finish lasts 1 minute, so I only need to use it once per minute. False. This is a rather rare mistake some dancers make, but it is somewhat understandable. The short version is the simple assumption that perhaps the cooldown of standard step is short enough to make sure you can refresh the buff when you need to. And given that the potency and all that is sort of a bit weird in regards to standard finish, it might not be entirely clear how strong standard finish actually is. When the job is initially unlocked, standard finish with 2 steps deals a whopping 800 potencies worth of damage. For 1 GZD, this would be absolutely monstrous in low-level duties. For 30-second cooldown even. For 2 GZDs, that's still 400 potency. Above average, and the AoE component would still amount to 160 potency, better than most of your other AoE options. But if it were 3 GZDs long, it would only be 267 potency per GZD, and at that point, it starts to look a bit meh. Now, standard step and finish combined takes 5 seconds to complete, meaning 2 GZDs. But if you don't know that, that would explain why standard step would look bad. It also logically could make sense that a cooldown meant to maintain an effect has a significantly shorter cooldown to make sure you can consistently maintain it. Now, the simple truth is that standard step and finish is one of Dancer's better attacks and should be used pretty much on cooldown, with very few exceptions. A mix of more complicated and simpler questions and claims. I hope you found some of them enlightening or interesting. Remember, if you've met a strange claim or myth that you would like explained or tested, do be sure to let me know about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, back in the day, some sources suggested the melee LB1 was actually a flat 6000 potency attack. Because of the fact it actually scales with the party's weapons, this would be misleading. However, a lone Viper using a 300 potency attack with no buffs in full Dawntrail tier 1 best in slot would deal around 15,500 damage, which would mean 6,000 potency would be around 310,000 damage. This argument completely falls apart when you remember the limit break would still do 310,000 in underpants.